If this thing craps out, somebody let me know.
I know. Okay, I'm going to take a bit of a turn. When I put the class together, I wasn't sure which order I should do a few things, and I don't know, it didn't feel right to me. So I'm switching the order. We're now going to talk about market failure instead of whatever I was supposed to talk about. I'm supposed to talk about non-market benefits. So we're going to do market failure first, and then we're going to talk about non-market benefits and the measuring thereof. So we're getting behind on the performance assessment tasks. You guys have to email me the next one tomorrow, right? By noon? Everybody's good with that? So this is a fairly long module, I guess we could call it, but after we're done this, what you're going to owe me next is an outline of the reasons and types of market failure. So what I want you to do is take a look at the performance assessment task that I outlined, that I provided on the outline, and let me know sooner rather than later if this has enough information for you. Do you need clarification? Because what I'm going to do is, if you need more clarification or you need me to bound the assignment by giving you more details, we can do that. I can also make it a bit smaller if it seems a bit too wide.
I got a question. In one like critique, you say like positive and negative.
Mm-hmm.
What do you mean by that? Like
about the sustainability?
Yeah, the sustainability one. Like, is it just like positive and negative sides of it, or?
Yeah, there can be. It depends on your view. So, for example, you say mining. We can do sustainable mining. There's positive aspects of that in terms of, well, I guess there could be negative aspects of that in terms of the environment, right? But at the same time, you might be promoting cultural or social sustainability and economic sustainability. So a company might make a policy or a ruling that promotes one kind of sustainability at the expense of the other. So if you see, if your example has positives and negatives about it, you can talk about both of those. You can also approach it from the perspective where you might think that nothing is sustainable, we're just consuming ourselves into the ground, versus technology will save us. So what's your personal opinion on the case that you select? And there could be positive and negative with that. Does that help? Okay. Any other questions about the sustainability assignment?
No, just can be any case study, right?
Any case study you want.
Can I use the community finance that we...
Can you use the what?
The community finance part.
Yeah. No, use whatever you like. Try to focus on a resource, but it's not entirely necessary. Okay? Yeah?
Oh yeah, on your email you sent to us is the company policy and the resource.
Yeah.
Must we write all of them or just pick a resource?
Pick any resource you like. So you can pick a company, you can pick a policy, you can pick how the government managed forests, for example. Describe the situation and talk about the the three big circles of sustainability. What are they? Anybody remember?
Social, environmental, economical.
Yeah, social, environmental, economical. What were the little circles in the middle? Where the two meet? Bearable, and a couple others, right? Viable.
Equitable.
Yeah, equitable. And the one in the middle? Sustainability. Okay, so you can address your case study using the three big circles. If you only have two big circles and the other one is a bit lacking, then what does this describe the situation? Is it equitable? Does equity describe the situation you're in at the expense of something else? Usually environmental. Okay? So it helps if how many of you have, do I want to know this? How many of you have you started it, finished it? Lots have finished? All right, A for you. It helps to have it organized. This is what I'm going to write about. No matter what you're writing, you have to tell a story. You need to tell a story. And the story has to resonate. So this is what I'm going to talk about. This is why it's important. And then talk about those things in order, right? So if you're logical, if you can communicate in a logical way, it makes it a lot easier to read, and it makes you more credible. So if you can do that, and then end with a couple of sentences saying, this is my opinion, this is what I've come up with, here are the results, the conclusions, the recommendations, that's great. Instead of just writing about this and writing about that, and I do not want you to put the kitchen sink in it. If I talked about it here in class and it doesn't apply to your case study, I don't need to hear about it. Okay? You want to talk about what's relevant. There's no, that's why when I get these 50-page papers, a lot of stuff's not relevant. You need to be able to be clear, say what you need to say that's relevant in, 2 or 3 pages or whatever it is. Okay? So you won't lose marks for showing me that you were listening where it doesn't apply. Or you might. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. I have access to a software. It's an evaluation software, and I believe it's better than the one the university uses. So if it's okay, I'm going to ask you to evaluate the class maybe next week. And you will get an email invitation to do that, and then you will go online and you'll actually click on this 4-square diagram. And what I'm going to ask you is the same questions that you see in that 400-page evaluation at the end of the year on how you feel about everything. But I'm going to ask you based on the importance of teaching methods and content, the importance to you and the relevance to you. So I'll ask you questions about the content and about the teaching methods and all that kind of stuff. And it's anonymous, I don't know who says what, but I'm going to use those results for my own purposes, and then I will compare them at the end of the year with the CRAP survey. So if that's all right with you guys, I will do that. You are not required to answer it, but if I get my shit together, I'll send it to you sooner rather than later. So, okay, so I'm just letting you know about that. Now, the next thing, just the performance assessment task is an outline. Again, I want you to provide the outline with, this is what I'm going to say, these are the relevant aspects, and follow this whatever it is, outline, I guess. And then there's some learning objectives there. Okay, so let's go on. I think I got to turn on the light. Everybody have a good Thanksgiving?
Yep.
Yep. Turkey, beer. Okay. I'm going to talk about market failure. So what is market failure? Bomb goes off on Wall Street, is that market failure?
Crisis. And failure mean like emergency or like crisis?
Not emergency, not crisis. Market failure, you know what the market looks like. We have supply and demand, quantity and price. This is equilibrium.
Right.
At this point, we have no waste. We have no waste, and people, the demands do not exceed supply. So you don't have unlimited wants at that price, and you don't have waste. What happens with market failure is the failure of the market to deliver an efficient quantity of goods. Failure to deliver efficiently. You could also say creates conditions whereby we have non-optimal allocation of goods and services. Resources, whatever. Okay. So typically, talk about 4 or 5 different things. And we'll go over these one at a time. So the first one is the difference between public and private goods. The second one we'll talk about is, I don't know if I can do these in order, lack of a market. Then we have lack of information. You don't have enough information to make a decision. We have monopolies. And then we have externalities. So we'll go over them in turn. So public and private goods are not goods that are provided by the government or provided by the private sector. They're types of goods. Public and private, those terms, have to do with the characteristics of the goods. Okay? So you could have a private good being delivered by the government. We can have public or sort of public goods, well, it's not easy, but delivered by a private entity. So when you think of public goods and private goods, it's really the characteristics of the goods that we're talking about. So the best way to think of this, you can do it 2 ways. I like the table. We look at characteristics. We do a table with 4 elements in it. So here we've got exclusion and non-exclusion. Okay. This also relates to property rights. We talked about exclusivity. Basically, we're dealing with the same thing. Can you exclude people from using a good? If you cannot, then you have a public good. Okay? If you can exclude somebody from using a good, then you have a private good. The other characteristic has to do with what happens to the total amount when you consume it. And there's a number of different words. We could call it rivalrous. We could say consumable. We could call it subtractable. So any of those words. What it means is when you consume it, there is one fewer for everybody else. So if you consume something, you're taking it off the market. It means there's less for everybody else. In a case like, say, a scenic view, if it becomes crowded and you're observing the view, say you're standing on the rim of the Grand Canyon, and your head is blocking the view for somebody else, it fits into this category. It means that your consumption is affecting others. The opposite is when your consumption does not affect others. So it's non-rivalrous, it's non-consumable, and it's non-subtractable. Okay? So if we have a good where you can consume, or you consume it, there's one less for everybody else, and it's it's exclusive and it's rivalrous, we call that a pure private good. And typically, we do not have market failure. So no market failure in here. So give me some examples of pure private goods.
If you have like an apple farm, your apples.
Yeah, apple farm. The apples are rivalrous. The trees are rivalrous. If they're yours, you eat the apple, it's gone, right? There's one fewer for everybody else. And it's exclusive. You can prevent people from using that good. Typically, those types of farms are managed by private individuals. What about if we take that apple farm and go in a different direction? What if it's a provincial forest? How would you describe the provincial forest? It's managed by the public, right? So is the provincial forest a private good or a public good? The forest, the trees. What is it?
Public?
Public? If we talk about public versus private in terms of characteristics, then what can we say about the trees? Are they exclusive? Like, we're talking timber harvesting. Are they exclusive? Yeah. Are they rivalrous? Yeah. So the forest, the trees in the provincial forest are actually a pure private good. And the reason that we look at goods in terms of whether they're public or private in nature is because it speaks to how we should manage them. If we have pure private goods, we don't have trouble keeping people from using them. Not a problem, right? So you don't need government intervention. If they're rivalrous, and if you consume one and it's gone, then we know what the marginal cost and the marginal benefit of that is. Typically, there's a price on the market, there's a cost of making that good or growing it or whatever. And so the marginal cost equals the price. We can do that here. When marginal cost equals the price, you have this situation. Here's marginal cost. This is marginal revenue or demand or willingness to pay, quantity and price. That's an efficient solution, right? So you do not need government intervention to produce pure private goods. So this begs the question, why does the provincial government manage the forest? Or why do any governments manage or allocate goods that are private? Would they be better off privatized? And that's a question, it's a question for you to answer. And when you answer that question economically, most often you would say, no. They are better off privately owned and privately managed because we are able to set the price according to the market and allocate the amount of quantity depending on the demand for that. So what complicates the situation in the forest sector? Think of anything? Yeah?
Say for example, government wants to protect some endangered species.
Yeah.
I mean, like for a private player, it doesn't matter if a bird dies, but
Yep.
government might want to care about it.
Yep, that's a good point. He says that the government might want to protect something other than the trees, endangered species, certain types of ecosystem, whatever. So in that sense, we're dealing with the forest, the trees are actually private, but the rest of it might be public, like wildlife. Wildlife lives in the forest and habitat is there. So to what extent is habitat a pure private good? It's not really. It can be rivalrous. If we cut it down, there's less for the animals. And it's exclusive in terms of we can prevent people from using it. But for the benefits, it provides benefits for the public that cannot be managed. There's no incentive to manage it for a private entity because they're not going to get payment for that. Maybe go to the forest and just want to pay because they're in there? Not generally. Okay. So pretty much any goods you see on the market are pure private goods. Any questions? What's that drug that you find in Turkey? Tryptophan? Is it all still coursing through your veins? Yes? Okay. A non-exclusive good. So give me an example of a good that is non-exclusive. You cannot prevent people from using it. So a good, a resource, or a service, where you can't prevent people from using it, but when they use it, there's one fewer. One less.
Ocean fisheries.
Yeah. And what do we have here? Market failure. So here's an example of market failure. And the reason is, if you cannot exclude somebody from consuming or harvesting, they're not taking into consideration the cost. The cost of using that fishery is going to be much higher than if it were a private cost. So in this case, the marginal cost is much greater than the price we pay for fish. So as soon as you have an inequality here, when the marginal cost is greater than the price, because we're not considering the future price. What's the future price of lost fish, lost habitat, damaged fisheries? Those costs are real costs to doing business. They're environmental costs, and they keep saying that we're running out of tuna and stuff like that. Well, as far as I can tell, tuna's pretty cheap. I could feed it to my cats sometimes. I mean, if you're feeding an endangered species to your cats, how endangered is it? The price of tuna should be much higher based on the fact, or what I hear, is a decline in tuna. So prices are much lower than the cost. And the problem with the cost is we're looking at a marginal cost that includes the boats and the licenses and the labor and all that kind of stuff. We're not including the environmental cost here. So if you can't exclude people from using the resource, typically it's overused. And the cost of overuse is not reflected in the individual decision makers' business decisions. This cost should be included, so we should have a marginal cost that's much higher, price should be much higher, and the quantity harvested should be much lower. If you cannot prevent people from doing that, though, this is the situation you wind up in. So it's failure because marginal cost does not equal price. This means that there's an inefficiency in the allocation of goods and services. So that's why it's called market failure. It's not a failure of the market system, supply and demand. Well, I guess it is, but it's a failure to allocate the goods efficiently. Okay, does that make sense? Questions? What other examples can you think of here in Saskatchewan, maybe? Anyone? Anyone? Stand here for a week. Okay, wildlife, they're poaching. Wildlife is another. It's non-exclusive because it runs around, especially the wildlife that crosses borders. It's rivalrous because once you kill it, there's not as much for everybody else. Wildlife, if you're a photographer, does not fit in this category because once you take a picture, it means there's just as many pictures left for everybody else. So it moves down here. So you can also think of this stuff on a scale. And the key to thinking about these types of goods is if you have a good that's non-exclusive and we have property or we have market failure, how do we solve that problem? We really want to be able to move from a non-exclusive good to an exclusive good. You take the case of bison. When the bison were wiped out, nearly wiped out across the Great Plains, the reason was because non-exclusivity. What was invented to save or to change the whole situation? Barbed wire. Barbed wire allowed people to protect their property rights. As soon as you do that, the cattle rustling goes down and you have an increase in the species that were formerly non-exclusive. So when you guys were, I don't think anybody chose there was a coral reef article about property rights. The idea was how do you make fisheries, ocean fisheries, non-exclusive? You pretty much can't because the fish swim around. But what they did around the Caribbean somewhere is identify the coral reefs where the fish were spawning. And they privatized the coral reefs. They also created more, and you can own your own coral reef. You sink a car, it's yours, you can go out, you can do whatever you want with it. So in that sense, they were able to take an aspect of that fisheries management, and make it exclusive. So they assigned property rights, and they were able to make it exclusive. Once this happens, you have a private good. You have incentives to look after it, you have value, and there's some expenses, marginal cost then becomes equal to price. Right? It's relatively simple, but coming up with the actual how to do it, that's the difficult part. No questions, I'm guessing? Okay. What do we have down here? Exclusion and non-rivalrous. It's an example of this. If it's exclusive and it's non-rivalrous. So you can prevent people from using it, but if you consume it, there's just as much for everybody else. There's lots of good examples in utilities. Have any examples? Yeah, cable TV, right? If you don't pay your bill, they're going to cut you off. Of course, if you know somebody who's got the key to that interesting box, well, you can pay for nothing, or you get it for nothing. But you have to pay. You have to pay for cable TV. You have to pay for Sirius radio. You have to pay for certain types of utilities. Why is it non-rivalrous? Well, I decide to watch TV. It doesn't mean my neighbor's TV goes off, right? It'd be kind of interesting if it did. But there's enough to go around. The signal is enough to make it non-rivalrous. So why would this, there's a market failure here too. Why is there market failure here? What's the failure of the market in this case?
The price is greater than marginal cost?
Yeah, the price is much greater than the marginal cost. What's the marginal cost of one of you signing up for cable today if you don't have cable?
Cheap.
Yeah, it's super cheap. And how much do we pay for cable a month? Not super cheap. I don't know, it's like 30, 40, 50 bucks for reruns and infomercials. So the marginal cost of setting you up is some guy comes to your house and flips a switch. How much do they pay? Like 25, 30 bucks an hour? So why don't you just pay 30 bucks for the cost, a little bit of profit on top of it, and be done with it? No, it's huge. So how do we solve the problem of market failure here? Anytime we have market failure in any of these areas, there's a call for government intervention in some way. Government intervention in this area is for property rights, for enforcement, or setting property rights. Down here, it's for regulation.
I don't suspect there's
So the solution down here is regulation. Should we regulate prices? Should we regulate prices for power, for water, for electricity, for any of those types of things? And the point is to regulate prices such that the price comes down to more accurately reflect marginal cost. SaskTel. How do you guys have the new network, new shitty network? I hate that I drive by this billboard every day that says coverage everywhere, except Innovation Place, except the university, except my house. And when I phone them to say, hey, I want my money back or release me out of this thing, they give me some sob story. If you want sympathy, it's between and in the dictionary. You know that one. Okay, so what's the problem there? It's not rivalrous, it's not non-rivalrous anymore, right? There are so many people on the network, so they keep telling me, last time I called, they said, well, a lot of kids have cell phones these days.
Monopolistic
And that's my
behavior.
problem. Pardon?
Sorry, monopolistic behavior.
Yeah, and so you need regulation for that. So what's happening in this area is we're moving, right now the example is it's not non-rivalrous, it's actually rivalrous. You make a phone call, there's so many people in the network that you affect other people's use. Okay, so in this area here, we have exclusion and non-rivalry, and sometimes there's reasons for that, and they are natural monopolies. If they're not natural, it's just a monopoly, again, we've got regulations to bust up monopolies, to make sure that there's competition. And competition will lower that price. And then we move away from market failure to a situation where we approach E, the equilibrium. Okay, so in this non-exclusive, non-rivalrous box, we have pure public good. So pure public goods are any goods that are non-exclusive, you can't prevent people from using them, and they're non-rivalrous. If you consume one, there's just as much for everybody else. So give me some examples.
Lighthouse.
What?
A lighthouse?
The White House?
A lighthouse.
Oh, a lighthouse, yeah. Looks like the White House. Have you heard that thing on YouTube about the guy who, they go back and forth complaining? One guy says, I'm due east, blah, 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 you're in my path, and some captain, he says, you move. And the guy says back, no, you move, you change your position. And the boat says, you change your position, I'm Admiral so-and-so. And this guy says, no, you change, I'm the lighthouse. Yeah. Okay, anything else? Pure public goods? Parks, yep. Lots of stuff. Atmosphere, certain types of water, ocean water. You can't exclude people from using it. It's non-rivalrous. So what's the problem with this? If you think back to the property rights issue.
You can't get money for it.
Yep,
You can't charge people to use lighthouse.
right? The price is going to equal 0 because to add one more user, the cost is 0. So this is the classic national defense. I can put that there too. So the price is going to equal 0. If the price is 0, that's the efficient price. You should not be charging people because the cost of adding one more user is 0. Then, the marginal cost is 0. Then that means the price should be 0. So if the price is 0, how is a private entity going to offer this particular good or service? They're not, right? There's no incentive to do that, and it's difficult to do that as well. How do you exclude people from using it? So in this case, we also have open access in a lot of cases. So the cost is good. There's a lot of degradation leading to inefficiency as well. Okay. That's all I have to say about that. Where does education fit? What do you consider education?
It's just university or public.
Good question. Yeah. Okay, university, since you're in university. Is that a public good or a private good? And the question is, depending on the nature of the good, who should pay? Should you pay for your university education? It's a private good, for the most part. Is it viewed as a private good in all countries? No. By all people? No. In Norway, if you were to go to Norway today, you as Canadian citizens, you would not have to pay tuition.
And in Finland, actually, so yeah.
Finland, you don't either, do you?
Always get it.
Okay.
My friend of mine just does her bachelor's free of charge.
Yep. So they view the Scandinavian countries that are much more socialistic than Canada, view higher education as a public good. They believe that if you go to university and you're educated, that you will provide goods that make society better off. And because society will be better off, you should not have to pay for that. In Canada and the States, more so in the States even, higher education is considered a private good because who is going to benefit from that? You are, right? You get educated, you get a better job, you reap the benefits of that. So, and society, we pay through, for your services as doctors, lawyers, plumbers, whatever, by paying for your services. So it's not a public good. So a lot of resources, a lot of policies comes down to this question, is it a public good or a private good, or somewhere in the middle? Which begs the question, who should pay? And I think, you know, our governments, the United States government, how much in debt are they right now? They hit the ceiling and then they moved the ceiling. Why are they in such debt? Do they pay for public goods or private goods? Does our government, does our local government pay for goods that are public or private? Most of the time, they're paying for goods that are private. So why don't we let the private sector develop and deliver those goods? There's no problem, there's no market failure. We can calculate, we know what the supply and demand are. We know what supply is, so we know the marginal cost of production and figure out demand. So why are the governments providing these types of goods, whether the resources or anything else?
Not enough regulation.
Yeah, they do this for, well, mostly votes, if you look at incentives. But they shouldn't be. They should be providing pure public goods. They should be providing regulation and enforcement, but they should not be providing these goods, not from an economic perspective. Okay? Any comments? So what you should be able to do is give me an example of each of these goods, talk about how it's managed, whether it's managed appropriately, whether it should be managed as by a public or private entity or the opposite, and what kind of things we need to consider to move the type of good into this area here. Okay? If we have market failure, why is it market failure? Is it because the price is too low, because we're not considering the cost, like externalities, which we'll talk about? Is it because the private sector just can't offer it? In those cases, when it's a pure public good, then it's okay for the government to offer it, because it makes sense. The public benefits, so the public should pay. Okay? You guys just look bored shitless. You've done all this stuff before? No? You're just bored. Okay. All right, then we'll just move on. Okay, I want to say one more thing about public goods. When we talked about demand, we had individual demand, right? So this is person number 1, person number 2, whatever. And then this is the market. Typically, everybody faces the same price. So let's say P bar. P bar, everybody faces the same price in the market. And then we decide how much we want to consume. This person consumes 1 unit, this person consumes 10, whatever. So in the market, we have maybe 11. By the law of demand, we know that if the price goes down, P bar 2, then this person will consume more, maybe go from 1 to 2. So everybody faces a demand curve. Here we go to, I don't know, let's say 20. Then we have, what do we got, 22. So we have our market demand curve. How do we deal with public goods in terms of adding them up to determine how much we have in the market? Can we do it this way? Does it make sense? If it's a public good, let's say it's a park. Let's say it's a park and we don't have to pay, but we want to calculate the value. Remember that the demand curve tells us this is the willingness to pay, this is the consumer surplus, this is the whole thing here, total value. Let's say we want to calculate the total value because we need to allocate resources. How do we do this? We can calculate, we know what the price is in this situation, and we can calculate consumer surplus for this for the private good. And we know if price is 0, then the total value equals a consumer surplus. But what's the difference between consuming 1, 2, 10, 20,000 goods and using a park? What's the difference with quantity right off the bat that you see?